It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello. This is the only show where you can hear the conversation that we have.
Yeah, it's a great show. And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, is here. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
On the show today, we're going to talk about unions. In 1955, more than a third of American workers were members of a union. Today, that overall number now sits at around 10%. Union membership in the private sector hovers at around 6 or 7%. What happened? In the first half of the show, we welcome a man who has had a long and distinguished career studying and writing about labor issues. His name is Stephen Greenhouse, and he has written a book entitled Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. That's just the first part of the show. In the second half of the show, we're going to talk about something that is not unrelated to the first part of the show, and that's how the 1% rule the 99%. Why does the 99% let them? What can be done about that? Ralph wrote a column earlier this month entitled The Shame of a Nation, where he lays out 19 points that outline that paradox. So David, Ralph, and I are going to have a spirited debate about that. In between, we will check in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, and his Corporate Crime Minute. But let's kick things off with what happened to the union movement. David?
Stephen Greenhouse is an award-winning reporter who covered labor and workplace issues for 19 years over at the New York Times. He has also served as a business and economics reporter, as well as a diplomatic and foreign correspondent. His latest work is Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Stephen Greenhouse.
Great to be here. I've long had huge respect for Ralph.
Thank you, Steve. Well, as you know, Steve, better than anybody, the number of full-time labor reporters for the media has diminished very significantly. It used to be almost every paper in a significant sized city would have a labor reporter, and PBS, NPR would have full-time labor reporters. So it's a very important you've got this book out, because books like this, listeners, don't come out every year. So let me get right into it. Most of the workers in our country are not unionized. I think your figures in your book is if you combine public employee unions and corporate workplace unions, it's about 1 out of every 10 workers in this country is unionized. And in 1950s, it was 3.5 out of every 10, 35%. So we're dealing with one of the weakest labor union societies in the Western world. So can you tell our listeners, I think they're sophisticated enough to know that without labor unions, we wouldn't have had fair wage standards, we wouldn't have had health care, wouldn't have had our weekends, we wouldn't have had a lot of things. So we don't need to go into that. But compare the state of labor law and labor unions in this country to Western Europe. What do workers have in Western Europe, whether they're members of unions or not, that we don't have here?
Thanks. So I wrote this book because I'm concerned that a lot of Americans, especially young Americans, know far too little about unions and what they've accomplished over the years, over the decades, and how they've lifted millions and millions of workers. And, you know, you think of the bumper sticker, unions, the folks who brought you the weekend. And a second reason I wrote the book is to shine a light on this huge problem that you raised, Ralph, that worker power and unions are far weaker than they used to be and far weaker than they are in other industrial nations. And as a result of that, there's this phenomenon that I call America's anti-worker exceptionalism. So what do I mean by that? So the United States, sadly, tragically, is the only industrial nation that doesn't guarantee all workers paid parental leave, paid maternity leave. There are only a handful of other nations in the world that don't offer paid maternity leave. Suriname, Papua New Guinea, and a few tiny Pacific island states. In the European Union, generally, women are guaranteed at least 6 months paid maternity leave. In the United States, they're not guaranteed any. Second, the United States is the only industrial nation that doesn't guarantee all workers paid vacation. In the European Union, it's 28 nations. Every worker is guaranteed at least 4 weeks paid vacation. In Germany, 5 weeks. In France, 6 weeks. Third, the United States and South Korea are the only industrial nations where every worker isn't guaranteed paid sick days. And I'm sad to say I've written several stories over the years about workers who got sick for a day or two and they got fired, or their 8-year-old, 10-year-old son or daughter got sick and had to miss school, and the workers took off a day or two to take care of them, and they got fired. And I say in my book that this is crazy, that in the world's wealthiest nation, people don't get these basic protections. A fourth, important thing that every American worker isn't guaranteed, and that is guaranteed in every other industrial nation. In the United States, workers are not guaranteed health insurance. And in every other industrial nation, they're guaranteed health insurance. So what does that mean? So that if you work in a factory with 1,000 workers and it closes to move to China or Mexico, all 1,000 workers might not just lose their jobs, but they and their families might lose health insurance. If you work at a big box store, or Walmart or Target, and it closes, maybe the 300 workers there will all lose health insurance, and their families too. That doesn't happen in other industrial nations. And I argue in my book that this is really bad for workers, and it's a result of there's so much corporate power in the U.S. compared to worker power that when some lawmakers who care about workers and propose laws to guarantee paid sick days, or to provide universal health insurance, or to assure that there's maternity leave for every worker, every mother, corporate America stands up. The Chamber of Commerce howls that we can't do this. This will be too expensive. This will be a horrendous employer mandate. And as soon as the Chamber of Commerce starts shouting about this, all these folks in Congress from a certain party say, we can't do this. This will hurt business, even though American workers are lacking in so many of these fundamental basic protections.
And, in your book, you have some heart-rending right at the beginning, paragraph by paragraph, on how the workers are mistreated. Patricia Hughes, a licensed practical nurse, came down with severe pneumonia while caring for a paraplegic in Colorado, coughing, vomiting with a 103 fever. She called her manager to say she needed to miss work for 2 days. I told him I was so weak there was no way I could care for and move the patient, she said. He responded, quote, if you don't come in tomorrow, don't bother ever coming back, unquote. Too sick to work the next day, Hughes was fired, and as a result of losing that job, she was evicted from her apartment. I mean, there are millions of examples like that. And so the question, to get to the core of it, I don't think the labor unions, weak as they are, Steve Greenhouse, are fighting with the power that they have, diminished as it is. For example, Labor Day used to be a great event with marches, cities, towns, workers marching, discussions. And it's so weak now that I wrote Richard Trumka earlier this year, and I said, I've talked to all these international unions. I said, why don't you rev up Labor Day? Because that's the one day that Meet the Press or other mass media will give union leaders their due. It's hard to deny them on the one day of the year. He wrote back saying it's a good idea. He agrees with me, but there's something wrong. They're not as aggressive. I remember meeting with Richard Trump in 2011. Steve, you'll like this story. And I said, why aren't you coming big on the minimum wage? As you point out in your book, it's $7.25 an hour, way below what workers were making in 1968, adjusted for inflation. It should be about $11 an hour. He pointed out through the window to the White House, he said, I'm not going to lead on this until Obama, leads on it. You remember Obama promised $9.50 per hour in 2008 campaign. By 2011, never talked about it for 4 years. So what do you think the unions should do now with their members and with non-union people? Because as you point out in your book, the polls are very high by Americans, including young people, supporting unionization of more and more workers. What do you think, say 1, 2, 3, the unions should do more aggressively?
Business lobbyists, conservatives, Republicans, the Wall Street Journal editorial board are always jumping down and complaining about, quote, big labor, unquote. And I argue in my book that, labor is nearly not as big or powerful as it used to be. And I point out that in the 2015-16 election cycle, corporations gave $3.4 billion to donated in the campaign, which is more than 6 times as much as Labor gave. Labor gave $214 million. In lobbying here in Washington, corporations spent nearly $3 billion, more than 60 times as much as Labor. Labor spends $48 million. And labor is totally swamped Trump by business. And that's why, even though corporate profits are at record levels, Republicans in Congress and Trump rushed to give this totally unnecessary trillion tax cut to corporations. So labor is weaker than it has been before, as you say, Ralph, and they have to get more vigorous and more sophisticated in mobilizing members. And one thing I've been saying is that, with the internet, you can do wonders in informing workers. I think one of the reasons Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania is that workers were too misinformed and they thought Trump was going to do wonders for them. And I think if unions did a better job communicating, educating, perhaps a weekly email, newsletter about, how Trump is hurting workers, how Trump has rolled back all these protections that Obama had provided, extending overtime to millions more workers. Obama issued this very important rule that doesn't get enough attention, that he would require Wall Street firms to act in the best interests of workers in handling their 401ks. And Trump, doing a huge favor for Wall Street and really stabbing workers in the back, scrapped that rule. So now it's much easier for Wall Street firms to rip off workers. And I think labor unions are not doing nearly as good a job as they should be doing in communicating to workers how Trump is, day after day taking actions that favor big business and hurt workers. So that's one big thing I think unions should be doing, is communicating better. Second, they need to do more organizing. There isn't nearly enough organizing to increase the size of unions. And the good news for unions is that a recent Gallup poll found that 64% of Americans approve of unions. That's the highest rate in nearly 50 years. That's up sharply from a decade ago when it was just 48%. And also promising news for unions is the age group that most approves of unions is the 18 to 34 age group. And a lot of young people are feeling good about unions. So, we're seeing graduate students, we're seeing adjunct professors, we're seeing a lot of people in my profession, journalists, we're seeing a lot of nurses unionizing, and that's very promising. And also, there's a recent study by MIT folks that found that 50% of non-union, non-managerial workers say they would join a union tomorrow if they could. Yet in the private sector, only 6.4%, only 1 in 16 workers are in unions. So there's this crazy disconnect. 1 in 2 private sector workers say they'd like to join a union if they could, but only 1 in 16 is in a union. So I think unions really have to do a better job shining a light on why it's so hard to form a union, and how corporations, far more than in other countries, fight to oppose crush unions. I have this line in my book that's gotten a lot of attention, and it's that in no other industrial nation do corporations fight so hard to beat back, indeed quash labor unions. And they threaten to close their plant if workers unionize. They threaten to even cut benefits if workers unionize. In 34% of unionization drives, one study found the companies fire the workers who are leading the unionization drive in order to try to cripple the unionization drive. So unions really need to shine a light on this. And we need more labor journalists who also are shining a light on how tilted the playing field is against forming unions when so many workers want to have a union.
Steve, the brazen level of greed and power of these CEOs, no CEOs in the world are paid as much as U.S. CEOs. The head of Walmart is making about $12,000 an hour, 8 hours a day, plus benefits, while 1 million of his workers are making less than $11.50 an hour, 8 hours a day, if they get a 40-hour week. General Motors was bailed out by billions of dollars, maybe over $40 billion taxpayer after they went bankrupt. And what are they doing? They're trying to freeze the two-tier level auto workers. They're trying to require higher co-pays of insurance by the auto workers. I know that they've got some sort of tentative agreement after the UAW strike, but they're paying their CEOs enormous money, even though the taxpayers bailed them out and the UAW bailed them out by taking all kinds of cuts and restraints that they took to save the company. So let's look at this astonishing thing. I would have thought the labor unions would have been out in the streets opposing Scalia, an anti-union, anti-worker Secretary of Labor, who's confirmed by the Senate, chosen by Trump. That's the one department they should say that's got to be of, by, and for labor. How do you explain the passivity? I know they came out verbally, but they didn't use any street demonstrations and convey to the American people, union, not union, that this labor department is not operating in their interests.
Well, again, great question, Ralph. On one hand, the labor movement is less militant than it used to be. Scholars like Stoughton Lind, have pointed out when, there's some basic non-militant aspects of the current labor system. Like if you sign a 3-year contract, that means you can't go on strike for 3 years. And that over the decades has helped make labor less militant. And, we have seen a resurgence of militancy with the teacher strikes, with the threat of in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona, Los Angeles, and now there's a threatened teacher strike in Chicago. The GM strikes, the biggest private sector strike in decades. In Boston, in New England, there was a big stop and shop strike with 33,000 grocery workers. There's a big hotel strike by Unite here against Marriott. So there is some sort of resurgence in the form of strikes. And I think labor is much smaller and weaker and less funded than it was years ago. And I think they try to pick their fights about when they're going to really try to get people into the streets. And you're right, Ralph, maybe there should have been a big mobilization against Gene Scalia. However, the Republicans are in control of the Senate. And, even if you launched a big mobilization into the streets, you might still get defeated and you might look weak. One of the points I've been making is that worker power is so weak in the United States that a president has the gall, the chutzpah, if you may, to name as labor secretary a guy who was long corporate America's top gun, its chief lawyer in fighting against worker protections and fighting against new worker protections. And what's crazy is that, of course, the main responsibility of the labor secretary is to protect workers, to come up with new worker protections, to make better lives, better working conditions for workers. So yes, I agree that it's pretty outrageous that Trump, who ran as a supposed friend of workers, has named an extremely anti-worker guy to head the Labor Department.
And you list this in your book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, Future of American Labor. You show how in area after area, Trump freezing the minimum wage, Trump, National Labor Relations Board, stacked it. It's against workers. Trump bragging about bringing manufacturing jobs back home. Manufacturing jobs have declined under Trump, not to mention average life expectancy. Exposing workers to workplace hazards, weakening the Occupational Safety Act, on and on. That's why I thought it would have been a good focus for them to make Gene Scalia a major issue. Because when I talked to labor union leaders in Washington, Steve Greenhouse, they said, well, a third of our workers voted for Trump. We have to be careful. Well, one way to show those third of their workers that they've been betrayed is to raise the issue of Scalia and all the things he represents. For example, he was in back of things like treating workers as independent contractors to deny them benefits and legal protections. As you point out in your book, employers require workers who move jobs not to compete, not to engage in disparagement, which is a violation of the First Amendment rights of free speech. They force them, as you say, into forced arbitration behind closed doors, which generally tilt more in employers' favor. There comes a time you got to draw the line in the sand. But anyway, what do you think of Stoughton Lind's new way? It's been in the press recently that more and more workers are moving to different models of organization. Can you explain that to our listeners?
So in my book, I explain that, unfortunately, it's very hard to unionize. And so, yes, it's great when there are unionization efforts. It's good when workers go on strike, when they feel that they've been squeezed, abused improperly. And, partly because it's so hard to unionize, I'm all for other types of concerted worker action. And I write about some great groups like the Coalition of Milwaukee Workers in Florida, not a union group, but it's an amazing pro-worker group that has done wonders in improving wages and working conditions for 35,000 farm workers, mainly tomato pickers in Florida. And we've seen other things, Ralph, like Google employees are generally very well paid. One could argue they don't need a union. A lot of them making 125,000 right out of college, but they were outraged, angry as hell about how Google was hiding, burying, mishandling all these terrible sexual harassment cases at the company. So the workers engaged in the type of independent, non-union collective action that Stoughton Lind calls for. Stoughton, who's a labor lawyer in Niles, Ohio, right next to Youngstown, wrote a book called Labor Law for the Rank and File that basically tells workers it might be hard to unionize, but there are lots of other good routes for you to protest, and here's how to do it without getting retaliated against, without getting fired. And believe it or not, these Google workers turned to the advice of Stoughton Lind, who's kind of a renowned leftist lawyer and professor. He was fired by Yale University because he went with, I think, Jane Fonda and others to Hanoi to try to help negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. And Stoughton is really a visionary in many ways on labor issues. And a lot of workers who feel that they're being screwed, squeezed at work, might love to form a union, but realize it's very hard. So they're following Stoughton's advice about, this is what we can do to protest. This is what we could do to sit in. This is what we could do to try to make things better at work without a union and without getting retaliated against. And I think a lot of workers are frustrated and they want to stand up because they feel that things have been unfair. Uber and Lyft drivers, they're told, and the Trump administration says you're independent contractors, not employees. And if the federal government considers you not employees, then you really can't unionize. So Uber and Lyft drivers are like following this advice of Stoughton and others. They've demonstrated, they've pressured city councils. In New York City, the Taxi and Limousine Commission did a study finding that 95% of Uber and Lyft drivers were making less than the minimum wage. And the Uber and Lyft drivers who are tired of working 60, 70 hours a week, struggling to support their families, they demonstrated, they pressured government. And lo and behold, the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission issued this rule that requires that all Uber and Lyft drivers receive at least $17.22 an hour after expenses. And that's greatly going to improve the lives of these Uber and Lyft drivers. And in California, the state legislature just enacted this important law that declares that in California, the tens of thousands of Uber and Lyft drivers shall be considered employees, not independent contractors. And again, that happened partly because the Uber and Lyft drivers were following Stoughton's advice and demonstrating and protesting and contacting legislatures, and things are happening.
Which points that the local city ordinances on minimum wage, state legislation on minimum wage, where the state doesn't preempt the way it does in Texas, is pushing the move forward for workers. My classmate at Harvard Law School was Paul Tobias, and when he got out of law school, he noted that most workers weren't unionized and something had to be done for him. So he started this group you're probably familiar with that has over 1,000 lawyers. It's called the National Employment Lawyers Association, NELA.org. N is in Nancy, ELA.org. And they're saying, we just can't wait for the right NLRB, the repeal of Taft-Hartley restricting unionism, all the obstruction to workers. We're going to try to fight for them in the courts and in other ways. Are you familiar with that? What do you think of that movement, National Employment Lawyers Association?
I think, National Employment Law Association, National Employment Law Project, these are terrific groups of lawyers who see how strong corporate power is, how corporations often squeeze and push around workers, and how weak, unions are. And they really form to try to help workers in many, many, many ways. A lot of workers are fired improperly and don't have unions to protect them. So these lawyer groups often go to bat for workers. There was this terrible Supreme Court decision earlier this year, the Epic Systems decision, that basically said that corporations have every right to prohibit workers from bringing class actions, and instead can be required to file complaints for forced arbitration. And, if workers who face sexual harassment or racial discrimination or sex discrimination can't bring class actions and instead have to bring individualized arbitration cases, it's going to be humongously harder for them to vindicate their rights, to enforce their rights, especially because, as you said, arbitration cases are behind closed doors and the employers have huge say in picking the judges, and they usually favor employers. So groups like the NELA and National Employment Law Project, they do a very good job going to bat for workers, fighting against forced arbitration, fighting against racial discrimination, fighting against sexual harassment. And at a time when unions are so weak, workers need all the help they can get. And it's good that there are these lawyers stepping up to help them.
Yeah. Steve, do you support the universal basic income movement, which is being picked up, and people like Senator Sanders and Senator Warren are speaking about it in the presidential race? And what about worker-owned businesses? Has that got a future in this country?
I think, so Andrew Yang is the main champion of universal basic income, and I've written some articles. I'm not a huge fan of the idea. If you provide, so Yang calls for providing $1,000 a month to every American over the age 18, over 18. And he says we need that because, in theory, automation, artificial intelligence, robots are going to cause the loss of tens of millions of jobs.
Which, by the way, you point out in your book that McKinsey Global Institute said by 2030, not far away,
yes,
automation will destroy more than 39 million jobs in the United States alone. 39 million jobs. Go ahead.
So, we've been hearing that for several years now, Ralph, and yet the unemployment rate is at 3.5%, the lowest it's been in 50 years. So people say, well, maybe technology won't destroy all these jobs. And I fear that, I think Silicon Valley is really behind this universal basic income because they worry that there'll be huge popular pressure against automation and artificial intelligence and robots. So they see this as a way to reduce the opposition. But I fear that, if you have people receiving just $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, are they just going to sit and rot and, live, become couch potatoes? And Yang says, well, a lot of them can go into business for themselves, can do arts and crafts, can become furniture makers, can become carpenters, I don't know. And that, he might be right, but I fear that a lot of people are not going to become entrepreneurs and that living on $12,000 a year is very, very hard. And I've argued that, one of the problems in this whole discussion of technology and the future of work is that there isn't nearly enough input from workers on what they want. And second, I think it would be very good if instead of companies laying off 20 or 40% of their workers and having them end up on universal basic income, that you have work sharing. So instead of laying off 20% of the people, you have people working 4 days a week instead of 5, and you share the work so people don't become couch potatoes and unemployed for years. You have them as gainful participants in society.
Steve, the unions sometimes don't know who their best friends are. Senator Sanders running for president 4 years ago, the biggest union guy that's ever run for president since Eugene Debs, and the unions endorsed Hillary Clinton, predominantly Hillary Clinton, who couldn't figure out whether the minimum wage should be increased or not for years. So last question, Tony Mazzocchi. He was, in my mind, one of the great labor leaders, even though he never ran a big union, but he was everything you'd want. He read books, he connected workers with scientists, he focused on the shop floor, he believed in demonstrations, he believed in repealing the bad labor laws. And you've written a couple articles on him before he passed away. Can you give our listeners a description of someone they probably never heard of?
But Tony was a real visionary, and in my book I say we need more people like that, leaders who are visionary, who are fearless, who know how to step up and step out and build huge solidarity around him. And Tony was a huge champion of doing more to protect the health and safety of workers, and he's often considered the father, the parent of the Occupational Safety Act. He said the Democratic Party isn't doing nearly enough for workers. It's too pro-corporate, and he pushed to form a labor party as a way to press the Democratic Party to move in a more pro-worker direction. And maybe belatedly, Tony's message has really gotten out because in the debate, the Democrats spoke far, 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 far more than I've ever seen in my 25 years writing about labor. They talked about the importance of unions and lifting workers. So Tony was really a prophet in his own way, and his message is really still out there and is really affecting how unions act and belatedly the Democratic Party.
Well, I can attest to that because in 1970, I worked shoulder to shoulder with Tony Mazzocchi to get OSHA enacted, led by Congressman Burton from California, to get enacted into law. And Tony was always complaining that, except for the United Steelworkers, the main unions were not really pushing hard because they were run by bureaucratic leaders who sometimes didn't even want to get in touch with their rank and file. They had their own cushy situation. We've been talking with Steve Greenhouse. Brand new book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. He reported on labor for the New York Times for 19 years. He knows what he's talking about. Get this book for your local library. Get this book for local discussions. The book is in all bookstores all over the country, independent and chain. Thank you very much, Steve Greenhouse.
Thanks very much. And get it for your children who don't know enough about unions and what they've accomplished. Thanks, Ralph.
Touche. Thank you, Steve.
We've been speaking with Stephen Greenhouse. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Can I ask Ralph about the Department of Labor, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Yeah.
The Department of Labor is about as old as the Federal Reserve. It started under Wilson. What was the Department of Labor initially supposed to do? And other than, say, the first Secretary of Labor and maybe Francis Perkins, has there ever been a Secretary of Labor who had the best interest of labor heading it, an organizer? Has there ever been a union organizer heading the Department of Labor?
Willard Wirtz was a very good Secretary of Labor under Lyndon Johnson. But in most cases, the Republicans, when they're in power, they appoint toadies to the corporate state. When the Democrats are in power, they push very moderate pro-labor people because they're afraid of the Republicans in the Senate fighting the confirmation. And heaven forbid that the Democrats make this a big issue like they should have with Eugene Scalia. Early on, the Department of Labor started with the mission of studying workers, labor statistics, reports. And as the years passed in the 20th century, the Department of Labor started getting more statutory authority to work in fair labor standards, for example, the labor pension area, for example. But by and large, it doesn't enforce the laws on behalf of workers against corporate outrages. I mean, the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, EPI.org, has estimated that workers are cheated out of $60 billion a year from employers who simply don't pay. They just say, get lost. We're not going to pay you. We dare you to sue us. And these are usually low-income workers. That's $60 billion a year. You'd think that would be a major issue among the Democratic candidates. So, good question, David. There are other points that Steve Greenhouse made in the book we didn't have time to talk to him about. And I know some of the listeners we have will say, why not? Well, we didn't talk about the right to work states. Over 20 states say that workers can refuse to join a union in a union workplace, but not pay dues, but they can take all the benefits of collective bargaining with management. I think the right to work states should be called the right to shirk states, in the sense that they allow workers to get the benefits without participating with other workers in supporting the union. Second, we didn't get into some of the nitty-gritty that Steve Greenhouse got into, and I'd like to just describe part of his book on the tomato pickers in Immokalee, Florida. A lot of tomatoes you eat come from this area in Florida. It's called the winter tomato capital. The workers arrive at 7 a.m. They have to wait up to 4 hours unpaid for the sun to dry the plants before they start picking and start getting paid. For many, the goal was to earn $60 a day, which meant picking 4,800 pounds of tomatoes in the blistering sun without any breaks or shade. Steve Greenhouse writes in his book that crew leaders regularly cheated pickers out of $10 or $15 of their wages or withheld pay altogether. He quotes, "When workers complained, the crew leaders sometimes beat them or fired them," end quote. Quote, "Female workers had it the worst of all. Crew leaders frequently groped them or demanded sex if women wanted to keep their jobs," end quote. This is how your tomatoes get to market, listeners.
Wow.
And I know some of the union organizers, they couldn't organize a union there because there were a lot of undocumented workers and they were frightened, of course, hired by the growers. But they did go to some of the big customers, like the fast food chains that buy a lot of tomatoes. And they said, give a penny or two per pound or whatever and have it go to the workers. And some of that worked. But basically, that area of Florida is the closest to indentured labor as you can get in the United States.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, David, Ralph, and I are going to talk about the shame of a nation. If you want to find out what that's all about, stay tuned. After this message from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 25, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The corporate experience of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's top official for the New England office will disqualify him from working on more than a score of Superfund sites in the region. That's according to a report from Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. In addition, he will be barred from working on new matters arising from 14 chemical companies in his new capacity at EPA. EPA announced the appointment last month of Dennis Desio to serve as regional administrator for New England. Desio worked for Dow Chemical as its director of governmental affairs. Dow is one of the leading chemical manufacturers in the world. Under ethics rules, due to his role at Dow, Desio is forbidden from participating in any EPA matter involving his former employer for 2 years after his start date. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Earlier this month, Ralph, you wrote a column with the provocative title, Shame of a Nation. The 1% rules, the 99% lets them. You sound frustrated.
How can millions of Americans take all this injustice, brutalization, deprivation, exclusion, rip-offs, denial of health benefits, denial of inflation-adjusted benefits, and so on and so forth? How do they do that? How do parents of children who they can't earn enough money to feed them, and 16 million children go to bed hungry at night in the land of the free, home of the brave? 20% of community college students are experiencing, quote, food insecurity, end quote. That means they have to go to pathetic pantries at community college with some old canned goods to make it through the day, and have huge problem getting housing as well. And the student loan now is 1.6 trillion. There's no student loans in places like Germany and Sweden and France and Italy because tuition isn't impossible the way it's education free, like high school through college in a lot of these countries. You know, what's going on here? Never have there been higher corporate profits, yet staggering amounts of poverty and near poverty remain, along with stagnant wages. Never have there been more medicines to alleviate pain, yet far too many of these painkillers have caused massive fatalities and addictions. 400,000 Americans have died from these opioids in the last 10 years. Where are the regulators here? Where are the parents of lost children to mobilize and demand that their members of Congress, state legislatures do their job? We outnumber these crooks, corporate crooks, political crooks. What's going on here? Never have there been more tax breaks for big business, yet big business uses so little of the windfalls for productive investments, creating good jobs, and for shoring up underfunded pensions. Never has there been more free access to information, yet so little retained knowledge. Never have there been more impressive muckraking film documentaries and books that expose corporate and government crimes, yet this media attention produces less impact and reform by the citizenry. Where do we go here? Never has technology made it so easy for heads of government to meet, yet fewer international treaties like on water, environment, labor, consumer, cyber are made between countries. Never has there been such an outrageous corporate crime wave, yet law enforcement budgets have actually decreased. The more big CEOs are paid, the worse is their management of their companies. The big banks, for example, 12 years ago, collapsed under the highest paid CEOs in banking history. The same for General Electric is in very bad shape, and they paid their CEOs enough money. Never have there been so many wrongful injuries that the court budgets are becoming tighter and the law of torts is being restricted. Without the defense and use of our civil justice system, wrongful injury cases cannot go to court with a trial by jury to compensate the injured or the next of kin. Never has the drug industry accumulated more profits and taxpayer subsidies, yet so many patients, millions of Americans, cannot begin to afford life-saving medicines. Never have the undertaxed super rich been so rich, yet on average give a smaller proportion of their money to charitable good works. Actually, Steve and David, middle and lower income people give more proportionately of their income than do the ultra wealthy. And I end this column this way. I could go on, readers. Pick up the pace, readers. Senator Elizabeth Warren has called correctly for, quote, big structural changes, end quote, that are long overdue and adopted by many other countries who aren't any smarter than we, but they're more active in the pursuit of their rights than tens of millions of Americans are. Take it from here, Steve and David.
So, Ralph, okay, so I'm Donald Trump. I'm debating you. I'm tweeting out, hey, the statistics just came out. Unemployment is at all-time lows, people. Median income is actually going up. Everything's going great. What are you complaining about?
It's total nonsense.
How do you square those statistics that come out with what you just said?
It's very simple. What happened is that he ignores real income adjusted for wages. He has frozen the minimum wage at $7.25. No one can argue with that. Therefore, there are tens of millions of workers are making less than 1968. So a few workers are making a little more, but 80% of the workers are making less than workers made in 1973. He ignores that. There are tens of millions of workers cannot afford housing. He doesn't talk about rising costs. They can't afford health care. He doesn't talk about pushing legislation, Trump that is, that would have stripped 20 million workers of health care under the inadequate but better Obamacare than anything he has yet proposed in health care. And he is not paying any attention whatsoever to stripping workers of their rights to bargain under the labor law, exposing them to horrendous workplace hazards and injuries. Like 100,000 workers are being exposed as we speak on their job to silicosis, a deadly disease. He's actually weakening the federal agencies that are supposed to do something about it. So he's picking and choosing based on the Wall Street bull market, which was created by taking $1.5 trillion that could have been collected from the super rich by Trump and sent back to create jobs that don't exist, improving our schools, highways, bridges, public transit, and gave that amount of money for tax escapes to the super wealthy. I mean, do you want to go on and on?
Well, you see how those numbers are very effective because they're simple and median income's going up. Unemployment for the African American community has never been lower. And how do you break through? How do you get those numbers to say? Simple. How do you say that's a lie?
It's simple. Black workers have never been in greater debt. He forgets the other part of the ledger. He forgets that they can't afford health insurance, that 40,000 Americans, many of them minorities, die every year because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. Nobody in Canada, Luxembourg, Taiwan, Japan, France, Norway die because they can't get health insurance. It's typical Trump. He uses very selected average type figures that don't include the actual livelihood situation of tens of millions of workers. For example, he says, look, at unemployment is down, but child poverty is up. Isn't that what counts? It's not just what you get paid, by the way. It's what you have to pay out for your living expenses, something he doesn't have to worry about. 40% of the people surveyed by the Federal Reserve said they couldn't afford an emergency claim on their budget of $400. They wouldn't know where to get $400 that suddenly was inflicted on them. That's 40% of 150 million workers. And he's talking about this is the best of times. He's a corporate crime aider and abetter. He's allowing corporations, credit card industries, banks, insurance companies, you name it, payday loan rackets, rent-to-own rackets, loan sharks, to rip off more Americans than ever before because he's taken the federal corporate crime cop off the corporate crime beat. Does he talk about that?
Well, there you say. Now, as I'm listening as just an ordinary person out there, and I want to get a message across, the idea that people don't have $400 for an emergency, that would resonate. That, to me, would be the counter to all of this. Hey, unemployment is at all-time low. Median income is going up. The counter to that I think would resonate with people on a very personal basis is what you just said. And I think candidates need to say that is, okay, you see all these statistics that are coming out of the stock market and the Wall Street Journal or whatever, the Labor Department, wherever they're coming from, out of the federal government. Do you have $400 if there's an emergency? That, I think, would resonate with people.
What also resonates is workers today, do you know that you're making tens of millions of workers? Listen to us. You're making less today than workers made in 1968, adjusted for inflation. Even though, because of automation, et cetera, you are twice as productive. One worker in Walmart produces as much as two workers of Walmart in 1968. You're getting zero benefit. All the productivity gains are going to pay Walmart's executives and top managers, and not to you, who produce that productivity every day. And in sheer dollars, you're making less than workers in 1968, adjusted for inflation, while your boss at Walmart is making $12,000 an hour plus benefits, and he keeps 1 million of his workers making less than $11.50 an hour. Some of them as low as $10.50 an hour, if they're lucky to get a 40-hour week.
So, Ralph, the richest 1% and Fox News would say, you want to unionize? You want to drive up our costs? We'll just take our ball and go to another country.
Well, if you go to another country, we will impose a social tariff if you try to sell back to the communities that you abandon. That's very easy. And you can also change the tax laws so they can't escape taxation, even though they live here, by having a haven in Luxembourg or some other tax haven. There are all kinds of ways you can deal with the unpatriotic, super rich abandoning the country that provided them with their immense wealth.
Ralph,
Okay, and
you just said
okay.
social tariff. Explain what you mean by that term. I've not heard that term, social tariff.
Social tariff is when a company that employs, let's say, 40,000 auto parts workers in Michigan or Ohio goes to China. They are exporting jobs, capital to China. The head of that company does not take a pay cut. The Chinese workers are lucky if they make $2 an hour instead of 20, 25 or whatever the unionized auto workers make. And then they ship these products back to the U.S. So the U.S. says, unless China moves toward greater equalization of wages instead of slave wages, fighting unions all the way, you are not going to sell back into this country without paying a tariff, which will go to support those communities that you abandoned back in Michigan and Ohio. That's what's called a social tariff, because the argument is that under international trade, countries like China, Vietnam, Thailand, India, Bangladesh, by pressing down on their workers' wages, which aren't living wages even in those countries, are engaging in an unfair anti-competitive practice against more developed countries. Now, this is what the International Labor Organization of the UN has written about repeatedly, but the unions don't grab this. They don't talk about social tariffs. All we talk about is, workers in U.S. have to give up their benefits, take pay cuts in order to meet the global competition. What global competition? Of serf labor? Of corrupt countries that press down on their consumer rights and allow U.S. corporations to go and pollute the air, water, and soil at will in order to get a competitive benefit against our higher environmental standards in this country?
I think the Republicans would say for the past 45 years, we've deregulated the economy. We've seen our economy grow to be the greatest in the history of civilization. Even poor people are living better than a pharaoh, than King Louis XVI. A person who can't come up with $400 still lives better than Louis XVI.
David, even Triumph wouldn't try that kind of argument.
Well,
you give me a break. I mean, you
or he would do it with an Eastern European accent.
You want to talk about the poor in this country have plumbing, and the richest kings 1,000 years ago had to go out and crap in a pit in the ground? I mean, or in a bowl taken away by a servant? I mean, let's look at it comparatively. In 1980, we had the highest average wages in the world. We are now maybe 23rd of countries in the world. In 1980, we were the creditors to the world. They owed us. We now are the biggest debtor with our trade imbalance, etc., to the world. We owe them. In terms of housing, we're far worse than at least 35 countries. You heard Steve Greenhouse say that 99% of all countries, including dictatorships, provide paid maternity leave. Only Papua New Guinea and a couple other small countries don't do that, except the U.S. doesn't provide paid maternity leave. We have, unlike all other Western countries and some non-Western countries like Taiwan and Japan and Israel, we leave 85 million people with no health insurance or grossly underinsured. 85 million people. We have some of the worst public transit in the world, requiring people to get up at 4 a.m. to go to work in a suburb cleaning houses by 8 o'clock. We have some of the worst educational infrastructure. Teachers have to pay to buy materials for the kids from their own pockets. Teachers are striking to get another $1 an hour. Teachers are denied unions. We have the worst union laws, anti-labor laws in the Western world by far. We have the highest infant mortality of 24 nations. Highest infant mortality in this great, rich, capitalistic economy? I don't want to keep going and demolishing your arguments, David, because you still have to live with triumph, who somehow has embedded himself in your brain for purposes of these kinds of questions.
Well, let me respond to that, because you've cited some statistics. My question is, but other than that,
yeah.
Nevertheless,
as Steve would say, well, you know the usual response to that kind of comment, the Lincoln Theater response.
Yes,
yes.
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. Other than Mrs. Lincoln, how was the show?
You started this segment off by asking, why do we allow this? And as you were rattling off those statistics and numbers and facts, I kept thinking we allow this because we live in a culture where Ralph Nader gets interrupted, where if you were to go on any television show or radio show, except this one, you couldn't get that out without somebody stepping on you. And it's more about the argument in America than it is the truth. I blame lawyers, quite frankly.
Well, corporate lawyers are far under scrutinized in this country. They're the architects of corporate crime, fraud, abuse, tax evasion, tax avoidance, regulatory evasion, regulatory violations. I mean, that's their function. Fine print contracts, block the courtroom door to injuries caused by their hazardous products. David, I just sent an email to Chuck Todd, Chris Wallace, and Jake Tapper. And I said, why don't you have some civic leaders on your show? Why are you excluding all civic leaders who really know what they're talking about? And I gave some examples. So it is true the mass media is not very helpful. On the other hand, the people of this country know far more about how they're being screwed than they're mobilizing to do something about it. That's the apathy gap. That's the gap I find inexcusable when all it takes is 1% of organized people, 2.5 million adults in 435 congressional districts, to grab control of Congress on highly popular measures like living wage, full health care, the usual list. And they're not doing it because those 2.5 million people, almost by definition, don't have to worry about daycare. They don't have to have 2 low-paying jobs and commute 2 hours a day. They're not doing it. What's their excuse?
Well, is it a situation where people are doing, well, I don't know, people are doing just well enough that they're not going over the edge. They're not going out into the streets. And there's also a psychology of oppression, which leads to depression. People working 2 or 3 jobs, they don't have time to suss all of this out. They're, one of the greatest advantages is the fact that people just don't have, they're too busy scrambling to make a living. They don't have time to, or the luxury, so to speak, that we have to think about these issues deeply.
Two answers. Number one, we're not talking about those people. We're talking about 1% of fairly upper middle class people who have discretionary time. They don't have to have two jobs, and they're not picking up the oars of the democracy boat. Number two, what about those people in the 1930s? They didn't even have jobs, and they sat in, they marched, and they formed labor unions.
That's what I'm saying. There was a tipping point there. They didn't have jobs. These people still have jobs, but they're low paying, and they've got to hustle 2 or 3 different ways to get them, and they're driving Uber and Lyft just to make it up, and they don't have the time.
So we're not talking about them. We're talking about 1% of the people who do have the time. They have a fairly decent middle-class income, but they are the contented classes that Kenneth Galbraith pointed out. Without the contented classes mobilizing, the lower-income people don't get anywhere. So that's why we're focused on the 1%. They know what the score is. They know how to mobilize, get their members of Congress back to town meetings, as we've talked about in this program ad infinitum. They know how to organize manuals that are all over the internet, how to hold press conferences, how to get out the vote. But you still, Steve, cannot excuse tens of millions of low-income people who decide not to vote. If they voted at a higher level than, say, 30, 40%, if they voted at a 70% level, you'd have never heard of Donald Trump. You never heard of George Bush. You never heard of George Herbert Walker Bush. We can do everything we can. We can put progressive candidates up. We can try to nudge the two parties with third parties, but we don't have votes. It's the people out there who've got to heed their pastors, heed their neighborhood leaders, however low income they are, and get out the vote every 2 years.
This has been a great discussion, but we've got to close up shop now. I want to thank our guest again, Stephen Greenhouse. For those listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for more of this discussion in the wrap-up.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Why are debates for politicians top down? Why don't you, the citizenry, organize and demand they come to your debate stage?
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up where Steve, David, and Ralph have an extended and wide-ranging discussion about voting, healthcare, the presidential candidates, and money in politics.
Well, I know Rob Weissman at Public Citizen has just put out a thing that says we should substitute Columbus Day and make voting a national holiday. And I also just read recently that New York City has adopted, or it has on the ballot at least, ranked choice voting. And ranked choice voting also increases voting because people feel that they actually have a say, and it's just not one or the other, winner take all.
That's right. There are a lot of things that can be done. League of Women Voters has proposed them over the years. They have to be picked up. We got to have same-day voter registration instead of all these obstacles on voter registration. Students at college, no, you cannot vote at college where you are. You got to vote back home 1,000 miles away, and you missed the absentee vote deadline. We should have universal voting. Wouldn't you agree? We should have universal voting as a duty, like jury duty is a duty. Australia has universal voting. They come out 96, 97%. In national elections, we come out about 60%. If we're lucky in national elections, I mean, what's the point here? We can't just have a Bill of Rights if we don't have some sense of legal duties. And if we don't vote, we have an excuse. We're sick, fine, that suffices in Australia. But by and large, when you have voting as a legal duty, all the ways that the politicians suppress votes, obstruct votes, intimidate votes, change addresses like in southern states for precinct locales, on and on, would be considered serious crimes. Right now, they're not prosecuted. It's that's all politics, But if you obstruct someone from doing their legally mandated duty, and by the way, they don't have to vote for the people on the ballot. If they don't like the candidates on the ballot, they can write in their vote. They can vote binding none of the above, which in effect says no confidence. So there's no civil liberties problem here. You can vote yes, you can vote for someone you write in, and you can vote no to all of them. And you still obey the law of legally exercising your mandated obligation to vote. So that's what universal voting does. And it also reduces billions of dollars of money that's spent on ads begging people to vote, on telephone banks begging people to vote. You don't see that in Australia. The money could be used to educate people and mobilize them so they know who they're voting for and are not going to be betrayed like 1/3 of union members voting for Donald J. Trump, who's betraying them every day of the week in 100 ways.
When everybody has to vote, each side becomes less ideological because you don't have to animate your side with anger, so you can have a calmer discussion.
Another benefit to universal voting. I hope the candidates in the Democratic primary will pick it up. They haven't been talking about it because they don't know how to argue it. They say, a Democratic primary candidate, you know their names, Harris and, Warren and Buttigieg and Betancourt and so on. I don't want to do that because people will be upset because they'll say, you're requiring me to vote for those rascals. Well, that's because they don't know how to argue it. No, we're not requiring you to vote for the rascals on the ballot. We're requiring you to vote any way you want. You can write in your vote. You can write yourself in, or you can vote none of the above. No more excuses. But the Democrats are too timid to make all the arguments, which I think will result in an issue that's extremely popular. 90% of the people are for binding none of the above on the ballot. So they don't have to stay home and protest. They can go to the ballot precinct and say, no confidence in all you people on the ballot. We want something different. We want a new election in 30 days with new candidates.
You keep saying they don't know how to win the argument. And I have a problem with the legal mind because it's bled into journalism. The truth now is arrived as an argument. We listen to pundits and we watch arguments. Isn't that the problem, that everybody's just trying to make their case so that even somebody like Rudy Giuliani, a lawyer, can throw enough mud into our eyes that he has an argument? Isn't that the problem? It's lawyers who just want to make an argument as opposed to arrive at a truth?
That's the problem when you're dealing with subject matter like the Ukraine that is outside the experience of American people as they go about their daily tasks. But when you're dealing with things that they relate to immediately, Giuliani would not be able to obfuscate. For example, in the debate in the Democratic primary a few days ago, the argument was raised that Elizabeth Warren's full Medicare for all would increase taxes. And she argued, yeah, but on the whole, people would be better off because the wealthy would pay a good portion of those taxes and people would no longer have to pay for health care, whether out of their pocket or for premiums. Okay. Now, did you hear any of the advocates of full Medicare for all also say that 40,000 Americans wouldn't die under full Medicare for all every year, that hundreds of thousands wouldn't remain sick and remain injured if we had full Medicare for all, that $350 billion that you consumers eventually have to pay for are stolen every year because of the present corrupt system? That's $1 billion a day. You think Giuliani could obfuscate that with his blarney? I doubt it, because people relate. They know they're being ripped off. They have people who have died in hospitals from medical malpractice because of hospital-induced infections. Oh, the person caught an infection and couldn't make it out the door of the hospital. Another argument for full Medicare for all is that 5,000 Americans a week die from preventable problems in hospitals. Some of them are due to greed. They're due to overdiagnosis, overtreatment, overprescription of drugs. You don't have that in a single-payer system in Canada.
Bernie made that argument. He just had to share the stage with 10 other clowns. But Bernie made that argument.
He is making the best argument of any of them But it took them a long time, other than talking about lower drug prices in Canada, to make the argument on 40,000 deaths preventable, hundreds of thousands injuries, diseases preventable. And he almost never talks about 5,000 dead every week in American hospitals, according to a study from the physicians at the well-regarded Johns Hopkins School of Medicine about 3 years ago. And they said that was their minimal estimate, 5,000 a week. So about 700 plus a day as we speak, 250,000 or more a week. Why hasn't he talked that?
Well, there's a scare tactic going on. We've talked about how, you said this, Ralph, how it is much easier to get people outraged when you threaten to take away something from them rather than convince them of something they don't have that they deserve. And the argument that the centrist Democrats are making against Medicare for all is that you're going to take away something from, you're going to take away the private insurance. And people get worried because that's the devil they know. And this devil they don't know is scarier. And I'm going to pitch my own thing here. And then you tell me what you think of this. Is okay, let's take away. How about we're going to take away the stress of you having to pay premiums? We're going to take away the stress of you having to pay deductibles and copays. We're going to take away the stress of you worried about having a catastrophic disease and going bankrupt. And there's a whole laundry list of things that single payer, that Medicare for all will take away. And if you could argue it in those terms, I think you could make a very effective case.
You're very correct. I'll add to your list. You take away, folks, the stress of a company firing you and stripping you of your health insurance. Happens all the time. Right. Or a company arguing with your union that they have to give up some of the health insurance benefits if they want to continue with a collective bargaining contract. That happens all the time. That's what GM wanted to do to the United Auto Workers in the strike that just occurred. Or you have a company you're working for that gives you health insurance, but they're allowing the health insurance to deny you all kinds of benefits that Medicare would not deny you of. So you're at great risk, even if you are one of the 100 million plus Americans lucky enough to have health insurance on the job. If you're 85 million Americans who are underinsured or don't have insurance, they are not in a position to make the claim that these centrist Democrats, so-called, are making. Now, in Medicare, you never get a letter from Medicare saying, sorry, we're stripping you of your Medicare insurance. You never get a letter from Medicare saying, if you don't agree to certain fine print, we're going to chop your health insurance in half. And to be sure, Medicare is backed by the politicians, but I think you have more influence over the politicians in Congress who think Medicare is untouchable. Even Republicans are afraid to challenge Medicare for the elderly. Then you have over the CEO of ExxonMobil or Alcoa or Pfizer or Citibank.
Why is Medicare for some a disingenuous and deceiving argument?
What do you mean?
Well, Pete Buttigieg is saying he thinks we get there by offering Medicare for some, that Americans should have a choice. They can opt in for Medicare if they're under the age of 65, but give Americans a choice.
Yeah, why wouldn't that work?
It doesn't work because it's called creaming off the best, lowest risks, which the insurance companies will increasingly not insure people who often get sick compared to people, young people, for example, who have a lower sickness level. That's one. The second reason it won't work is because if you have full Medicare for all, you can control drug prices, you can control the price that's charged for hospitals. They can no longer charge you, as they did once in Berkeley, $3,000 for a 3-mile ambulance drive from your home. And the people who want full Medicare for all do not make that point enough. If you have a mixed system, you do not control the skyrocketing price gouging of the drug companies, the hospital chains, and the specialized firms that charge you 3 times more for a hernia operation in the US than you get charged, for example, in Canada, everything else being equal. So full Medicare goes hand in hand with the control of outrageous prices gouging the American people and the elimination of huge executive salaries and benefits that now are at the height of Aetna, Cigna, United Healthcare, and so on. One CEO of one insurance company 2 years ago pulled down $60 million 1 year. That would not happen under full Medicare for all because they replaced the insurance industry. One last point. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson wanted full Medicare for all, and members of Congress, they were Democrats, said, Lyndon, we'd like to do that, but the Vietnam War is costing us a lot of money and we're going into deficit, so we can't afford it. So we'll just give it to you for the elderly and a smaller program for the indigent. All right. So people popped up and said, gee, I'm 74 years old and I have health insurance because I'm still working for a company. They didn't say that because they got guaranteed Medicare. So the argument that's going around today that you posed, Steve, was handled in 1964. People knew that Medicare for the elderly meant what it said, that it was going to cover them. And if they had to drop their private insurance that was so risky and so limited and so full of fine print and could be taken from them, they said, who cares? We're going to go to Medicare because the government is not going to take it from us, like a private corporation that may go bankrupt, be mismanaged, or be simply cruel and greedy could do.
Well, that's one of the differences, Ralph. You lived through all of this. You have that wisdom of experience. And some of these well-intentioned but callow candidates, like a Pete Buttigieg, who doesn't really have that memory or that knowledge because he didn't live through it. And if he's going to know it, he's going to have to be taught it. It's not the same. That's why I don't trust that. That's why the older you are, I think the better. I have no problem with the older candidates.
Right. Let me ask you this. I really don't understand something, Steve, and maybe Ralph can explain this. Joe Biden's going to be 80 years old. Yeah. He's provided for. He's got all the money he's ever going to need. All his children have all the money they're ever going to need. They can trade on his name. So why does he deceive on Medicare for all? Because they say, well, he's taking money from the healthcare industry. Does he need that money personally, or is it for his campaign? Like, what is the connection between somebody like Joe Biden taking money from health insurance lobbyists and his wanting to do good for this country? Where's the corruption there?
Well, it probably has something to do with the fact that he was involved with Obamacare and he wants to justify that as the great achievement. I would say there's a psychological thing there that he's not going to say, oh, I was wrong about Obamacare because we need to get to, he's associating himself with that, identifies with that.
Both of you are correct. He does want to raise big money from corporations and corporate PACs if he gets the nomination, which I don't think he will, to deal with the billions that the Republicans are going to raise. He doesn't want to contradict Obamacare because he was part of it. And as long as he is in the top tier in the polls, he will behave that way. Once he drops in the polls, he may change his language and become closer to the ideal of universal health insurance, at least in his rhetoric. But the other thing is something you pointed out. He's had a comfortable life all these years. He's been in Congress when he was about 30 years old. He was the youngest senator, and he was fully covered, and he's been fully covered by health insurance and other adequate benefits like pensions for his entire life. And then he made a lot of money in recent years after he finished his vice presidential term. So he's not part of the risk. He's not part of the solution. He doesn't really care the way I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, because at one point in their life, they were poor and they were low income and they felt the sting. And fortunately, they still remember it.
Is Bernie, just on Citizens United, If Bernie takes no money from corporations, can he do that all the way to the general election? And if he were to get elected without taking any money from corporations, how much does that weaken the Citizens United decision?
It weakens it a great deal, because at least people who can raise hundreds of millions of dollars on social media, and Bernie raised about $225 million 4 years ago. And if he ever got the nomination, I mean, that would zoom up toward $1 billion. They don't need corporate money unlimited to PACs to support their candidacy, which was permitted by the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. The other side, the Republican side, would continue to need what Citizens United unleashed, which is that corporations can give unlimited amounts against or for any candidates for local, state, and national office, as long as they don't coordinate with the candidates, which is an easy barrier to obscure.
You were originally a consumer advocate. You trained an entire generation or two not to trust advertising. When you ask, why are we not protesting? It's because we've lost consumer advocates in this country. People believe advertising. Something happened on your watch, Ralph.
Yeah,
Americans believe what they're being told through paid advertising.
When the people rise and get some breaks in American history, there's always a counterattack. And we had a few years when we could get bills through Congress and get them signed by the president. And then the corporations poured money, poured lobbyists into Washington. The Democrats decided to raise money starting under Congressman Tony Coelho in 1979 from corporate contributors, corporate PACs. And we lost the one party who we could rely on to get our votes through Congress on labor, consumer, environmental measures, at least up to a point. And not having one of the two parties standing up for the people leaves us with third parties, which are marginalized, obstructed, impeded, and are told, get lost. It's a two-party duopoly. Actually, a kind of message that the Supreme Court, in one of its decisions, actually indicated that this is a two-party country. That's news to our founding fathers.
If we didn't need advertising, wouldn't the money then leave politics? What do you need money for if you're running for office other than advertising? A little organizing, but you ran for president. Did you need money for advertising?
I could have, because 80% of the people didn't even know I was running. Even though people knew my name, 80% knew my name, what I've done, they didn't know I was running because there was no mass media and we had no money for ads. So how do you run in every state, big auditoriums filled, and at the end of the day, on election eve, 80% of the people don't even know you're running. You don't even know you're on a ballot. How are they going to go and vote for you if they don't know you're running? Because we're blacked out by the mass media and we don't have money for ads. True, if you got rid of ads, which you really can't do under the First Amendment, it's considered free speech right, you would have more money to educate people, to mobilize the neighborhoods, to get out to vote.
The British banned advertising during like 90 days before an election, right?
Yeah, they have short election periods. I mean, look, the race for president starts 2 years before the election day in our country. Other countries look and say, are you crazy? This is nutty. What are you doing that? What are you doing that for? In parliamentary democracies, it's usually 2 to 3 months, maybe 4 months. You get out there, you meet the people, and then they vote.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we speak to Thomas Muller, author of Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in the Age of Fraud. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too